I was recently lucky enough to get flown out to Sydney to get hands on with the upcoming Assassin's Creed Mirage, and I'm not sure I've ever had this much I've wanted to say about a video game. As long-time viewers will know, the Assassin's Creed series is very near and dear to my heart, having 100%ed most of the earlier games and playing all 13 mainline entries. As any Assassin's Creed veteran will tell you, however, the series has tended to have phases that have drastically changed the core philosophy of what makes an AC game. The first game was initially supposed to be a Prince of Persia title, but by taking advantage of next-gen hardware, Ubisoft were able to make a more mature open-world game that wouldn't have previously been possible. After critical acclaim and 8 million copies sold, Ubisoft knew they'd cooked up something spicy. The second stage, and my personal favorite, would start 2 years later with the Ezio trilogy, where a move to Renaissance Italy would see the series be greatly refined and vastly expanded. The third stage was the American saga, where combat would take center stage alongside the New World, and Ubisoft's naval warfare experiment would lead to the creation of Black Flag, very often cited as the best entry in the series. Next up was the now praised Assassin's Creed Unity, where combat was shaved down and stealth was turned up. If you've ever seen an Assassin's Creed parkour montage on YouTube, this was almost certainly the game they were showing, and most players agree that free running has never quite managed to reach these same heights. By the time Assassin's Creed Syndicate came out, franchise fatigue from 8 back-to-back releases was starting to set in, which is when Ubisoft went back to the drawing board to figure out their next move. We should probably point out that at the time, The Witcher 3 had just taken the gaming world by storm, and the developers at Ubisoft were clearly taking notes. We now get to the fifth stage, with the somewhat connected RPG trilogy, and this is where my interest in the series started to fizzle out. Free running was trivialized, with the player being able to scale sheer rock faces. Combat was reworked from an Arkham style into a stats-dependent hitbox system, and social stealth was entirely removed. The series was no longer my Assassin's Creed, and despite being undeniably successful, the similarities seemed to end at the name on the box. Enter Assassin's Creed Mirage, Ubisoft's answer to Assassin's Creed boomers like myself. This was a title promising to bring back its more complex free running system, social stealth, the Assassin's Brotherhood, a denser story, and as I'm sure IGN will explain, a way to make you feel like you're an assassin. This was obviously a game made with me in mind, but after getting hands on with it myself, my thoughts are complicated to say the least. Mirage is very much drawing from the template of earlier games, with subtle architecture throwbacks, a Brotherhood very reminiscent of the original game, and even a lot of the older tools which make a return. In a lot of ways, however, Assassin's Creed Mirage is trying to be all things to all people, retaining many of the drawbacks of the RPG entries, while misunderstanding a lot of the fundamental reasons the earlier games were so popular. I've previously avoided comparing the RPG Assassin's Creed titles to the older entries, because I accept that they are trying to do entirely different things. With this in mind, you're going to hear me compare Mirage to the earlier games quite a lot in this video, because they very explicitly designed this game to be reminiscent of their earlier works. Let's start with the story. Assassin's Creed Mirage is set in 9th century Baghdad, where players follow a coming-of-age story for Basim, a character initially introduced in AC Valhalla. Although the premise of a rise through the ranks assassin story isn't anything new, the order itself has been neglected throughout the past few titles, and it feels really fucking good to be back. Admittedly, I was only able to get hands on for around 2 hours, but over that time, the writing especially, was particularly rough. The earlier games, and especially the Ezio trilogy, were so beloved because Ezio himself was such a charismatic and larger-than-life protagonist, and the writing was just so fucking charming. Just look at this shit.
Don't you recognize me? It's me, Mario!
Uncle Mario?
Don't you dare!
Our uncle is un mostro. This is outrageous.
What's happened?
He's making me work.
Ezio, my friend. Ah! Ma che ti piglia?
You should find an outlet.
I have plenty of outlets.
I meant besides vaginas.
Who goes there?
Salve to you too.
Ezio! I was expecting my wife.
Somehow that does not surprise me.
Compare that to this cutscene.
What fresh brew do you have for me today, Cog?
No brew until Luca returns my crate. But if you have come to buy tea, I have many recommendations.
Cog, it is me, Basim.
你是谁啊? Who?
Basim.
It should be noted that Mirage is clearly a much smaller game in scope than the last few entries, with the game itself initially conceived as an expansion for Valhalla, before it was worked into its own title. I only say this because at least on the story front, it doesn't seem as if the team was given as much time to put in the extra care to polish and refine the writing and cutscenes. Basim's line delivery could sometimes fall a bit flat, and no fucking joke, some conversations legitimately sounded like they were written by ChatGPT.
Greetings.
Be welcome here.
Let us see what you have got.
Here is what's available.
This isn't usually something that would bother me so much, but after playing nothing but Baldur's Gate and Starfield for the past month, listening to some of these conversations gave me fucking whiplash. If you haven't already realized, Mirage is very much intended to be a less ambitious game, and with a $50 price point, Ubisoft knows that they haven't exactly swung for the fences this time, as this is rather supposed to be a shorter and more contained experience. I'd personally much rather see a shorter story if it meant it was more polished and engaging, but judging from the 3 or 4 cutscenes I saw, I'm still not sure this is the case. Moving past the story, the earlier titles were always built on 3 foundational pillars. The first is free running, and although this is much improved from the RPG titles, I'm very sad to report that it's still far from the high water mark for the series. Environments are obviously more designed with free running in mind, and planning out routes are also much more necessary for efficient movement, but it still leaves a lot to be desired. It feels as if they tried to replicate the earlier cities without really understanding what made them so easy to navigate. There seems to be attempts to string routes together, but they still don't seem to have taken center stage when designing a lot of these spaces. However, this may also be down to the controls, which seem to be another half-baked attempt to replicate their earlier efforts. At the peak of Assassin's Creed free running, players were able to free run neutrally, free run up, and free run down. This allowed players to vault over objects as opposed to jumping off of them, descend safely as opposed to jumping to their death, and generally give the player much more control over how they navigated their environment. In Assassin's Creed Mirage, however, there is only free run up. There are no ways to neutral free run, no option to free run down, and when combined with such a busy environment, you really miss having these long absent additions. White Light is going to be very upset when he hears about this. I should probably admit that the footage you're seeing was captured on an Xbox controller I've never held, on a very different control scheme from the earlier games. I'm not exactly showing this new system at its peak, but as someone with probably 1000 hours in this series, this rendition of its free running system is a long way from its glory days. The next pillar is combat, and more than anything, this might be my biggest gripe with the game. Combat in Mirage has no shit been simplified to 3 buttons: attack, parry, and dodge, and this isn't an exaggeration. Combat is very much designed to be a last resort tactic, as even as many as 3 base enemies are enough to get in a few cheap hits and end your assassin career for good. From the promotional gameplay, I had always wondered why there was so little combat shown, and it turns out that it's just because there isn't much to show in the first place. Enemies can either be parried to be opened up for an instant execution, or they're so tanky that it's not even worth your time trying to fight them at all. It could also be my video game journalist skills showing, but some of the enemies seem to use uncounterable attacks with very little wind up, which just leads to the player being very quickly cut down. At this stage, you might think that the combat simply gets deeper as you progress through the game, but I couldn't see any indication of this during my playtime. The portion I played seemed to be at least into the second half of the game, and there are only 2 skills out of the 23 slots on the skill tree that have anything to do with combat. If you're someone who would play this series to openly fight people, I really can't recommend it in any reasonable capacity, because at least in a gameplay sense, it's by far its weakest feature. The flip side of this, and the third pillar, is the game's stealth systems, and this certainly looks like it received the most amount of attention. In nearly all Assassin's Creed games, stealth has often felt weak, because combat is so strong, but as you've probably guessed this time around, stealth is so strong, because combat is so weak. Assassin's Creed Mirage is very much a stealth game above all else, and I expect your enjoyment will be very much down to whether you like this style of gameplay. The good news is that in the context of Assassin's Creed, Mirage might have the strongest stealth systems of the entire series, but this doesn't mean players should expect a remix of the formula. All enemies are thankfully able to be instantly killed by a stealth assassination. Shrubbery and social stealth return to expand hiding options, and players can even kill guards after disengaging from a fight if they don't know where you are. Enemies in Mirage are quite funny, as at least when playing on normal settings, they can be pretty oblivious when they don't know you're around, but as soon as they engage you in a fight, they turn into a bloodlusted giga chat and start throwing some serious hands. Progression in Mirage has a few different dimensions. Weapons can be upgraded to deal more damage, and outfits can be upgraded to enhance their perks. As previously mentioned, almost the entire skill tree is dedicated to stealth, and a lot of the stealth skills are dedicated to upgrading your tools. The most surprising part of my hands-on was that there's actually an entire upgrade system for the player's different tools, and there look to be around twice the collective upgrade options for these when compared to the normal skill tree itself. I'm not actually allowed to show footage of any of the menus from my playtime, but the tool upgrades did things, such as let throwing knife kills dissolve the body a few seconds after death, or turn the distraction bomb into an area of effect stun. You could even tune the smoke bomb to give enemies amnesia and forget about you completely, but these were all pretty late in their progression. To give Mirage credit, tools within Assassin's Creed often felt underutilized, either because combat was easier and quicker, or that the tools themselves weren't always that interesting. But with how the difficulty has been tuned, I expect many players will be thinking more broadly about how they can best approach each problem they might encounter. What I will say, however, is that the smoke bomb is still absolutely the best tool in the game, and I expect many encounters will be trivialized by its use. Although arguably not as powerful, many fans were skeptical of the previously featured Assassin's Focus ability, which allows Basim to mark a string of targets, then essentially teleport to each one to take them all down. There's a case to be made that this might not fit in an Assassin's Creed game, but seeing as the last few entries had the player explore Atlantis and literally wield the Hammer of Thor, the ability to move really fast doesn't seem too far-fetched. The ability itself needs to be charged up. It takes a fair bit of investment to upgrade, and players who really don't like it can very easily pretend it doesn't exist. As previously mentioned, social stealth is also back in Mirage, which allows players to hide on benches, blend into a crowd, and pickpocket citizens, which is now part of a quick-time event. Social stealth isn't always easy, as with the notoriety system returning, civilians will actually call you out to guards if they recognize your face, often forcing you to flee the scene. Tailing objectives also return from earlier titles, something they previously removed for good reason, but they don't seem to be nearly as annoying this time around. I did my absolute best to get caught by the person I was supposed to be following, and they really weren't bothered that I was listening in on their conversation, so I doubt we'll be seeing many instant fail states within Mirage. The ability to hire mercenaries, or bribe town criers, also returns from earlier titles, but I was surprised to find that you couldn't just pay them to do what you wanted. For whatever reason, the game has faction tokens that pay for these special services within the game, and I'm still not sure why they'd design it this way. It just seems insane that people who fight for money would refuse to fight when given money, because that's literally their job. It got even stranger when I couldn't open a chest, not because I didn't have a key, but because I was out of merchant tokens. Either Assassin's Creed Mirage has sentient chests, or this is one of the dumbest fucking things I've ever seen. My immersion wasn't broken when I started teleporting, but it sure as shit ceased to exist when I had to pay a box to give me its stuff. The capstone of my playtime was a black box mission, a type of open-ended assassination scenario that was first introduced in Assassin's Creed Unity. The premise is that you're given a target within a particular area, and slowly but surely you collect information, gather allies, and plan a way to put your target in the forever box. My thoughts on black box missions within Mirage aren't quite finalized, as from what I played, I wasn't sure if I had any real choice in how I could find and kill my target. If true black box missions return, this will be an excellent addition from the earlier titles, but if it's just following an invisible checklist, it's hard to justify why they'd add them back at all. I can't comment on this now, but with launch not too far away, it won't be long before we can find out. I wasn't allowed to show any of the menus for spoiler reasons, but I was however allowed to talk about pretty much everything I saw. Firstly, the footage you've been watching was running on a 4080 PC and playing at 4K, 30 frames per second quite comfortably. I don't remember seeing any upscaling options when I looked at the graphics settings, but Far Cry 6 had AMD's FSR, so I'd probably expect that here as well. Unfortunately, they were only able to give me 1080p footage of my playthrough, but apart from a donkey climbing on top of a fence, the game both ran and looked pretty good. As much as I've been critical of many gameplay aspects, Assassin's Creed has always been exceptional at bringing certain time periods to life, and Mirage is not about to be an exception. The map only seemed to include the city of Baghdad, which is an extremely welcome change, considering how bloated their last titles have become. The team also brought back the old database, which is just a fun way to learn about the culture of the time, the people you meet, and the buildings you climb. Ubisoft has confirmed that there are no plans for post-launch DLC, but there is an in-game cosmetic store if players wanted to pay a few dollars for a flaming horse or something you might see in Fortnite. Even a week after my hands-on, I'm still torn on my first impressions of Mirage. On one hand, this is a return to the original vision for Assassin's Creed, but on the other hand, this isn't intended to be as ambitious as previous entries, and that absolutely shows. It's no secret that the upcoming Assassin's Creed codename Red is intended to be their next flagship entry into the franchise, as not only does it have a far longer development timeline, but it's also set in feudal Japan, a setting which fans have wanted since the franchise began. It seems clear that Mirage was simply intended to be a way for Ubisoft to fill their 2023 calendar, and as a result, we are left with a game that probably would have been exceptional had it been given another year of development time. I expect Mirage will be enjoyed by a lot of old school fans of the series, and by people who just appreciate a 20-hour stealth game, not held down by AAA bloat. Context aside, I actually really like Assassin's Creed Mirage, and I still intend to give it a full playthrough when it comes out in early October, because although I had my problems, I still enjoyed every minute of my time with the game. I wouldn't even have the capacity to be so critical if the series didn't have a special place in my heart. In nearly every single way, however, Mirage manages to be outshined by one of its predecessors, and I can't help but wonder what could have been had Ubisoft decided to swing for the fences as opposed to playing it safe.